Alright, this is an overview of World War II in Europe from a military perspective. We talked about the Axis strategies, namely Germany's strategy to defeat the Soviet Union quickly as Hitler turned his back on his non-aggression pact with Stalin. He was hoping to gain the Soviet oil fields very quickly to keep his war machinery running. Hitler also hoped to force Britain out through campaigns in North Africa, bombing campaigns, submarine warfare in the Atlantic. There was a whole battle of the Atlantic going on during World War II. All these campaigns we talked about as broad strategies associated with Germany's plan to gain dominance. As far as the Allied powers, they're known as the Big Three, including the United States and its President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Great Britain with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill leading the way, becoming quite famous, we learned, for his speeches encouraging Nazi defeat in the Battle of Britain. We talked about that aerial campaign. And then finally, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, comprised the last of the Big Three, which is kind of strange, we said, because of Joseph Stalin's brutal ruling nature in his own country. But of course, if Stalin is attacked by Germany, then Stalin will come in on the Allied alliance powers. So our great threat at the moment is dealing with Hitler. And the three Allied powers will come up with a strategy of Hitler first, meaning that we're going to focus on Europe. We're going to focus on Hitler first in our strategies, and then we'll focus on defeating Japan's imperial aggressions in Asia and the Pacific Rim. So we'll turn to that secondly. In terms of battles, we talked about El Alamein, which was primarily an Allied victory, primarily a British victory in Egypt against the Nazis, against the Germans. The Germans were making a threat on the Suez Canal. So that prevents Hitler from gaining the Suez Canal, prevents Hitler from gaining oil in the greater Middle Eastern region, and prevents Hitler from gaining a southern route here to the Soviet Union. This will also help to aid in the general victory of the Allied powers in North Africa. So that's one of the very first early key victories. We talked about the Sicily campaign. This was Operation Husky that the Allies will wage. This is the moment when Italy will fall out and pull out of the Axis power alliance. The other major battle we talked about is Stalingrad. Stalingrad is a turning point in the eastern theater of World War II. There were thousands of Germans that were killed or captured while trying to gain Soviet oil. The Soviets, citizens, military will fight to the death in defense of Stalingrad. It will become one of the bloodiest battles of the war for the Soviet Union. But ultimately, with the help of wintertime setting in, the Germans will lose, and Stalingrad will represent a turning point in the east. So from here on out, Stalin and the Soviet troops will be forcing a retreat of German forces out of Eastern Europe. So the Soviet Union will be liberating Eastern Europe from the Nazis. And then the final theater of the war, we looked at the Western Front. This would be known as Operation Overlord, with the goal to liberate Western Europe, Western France here, from the Nazis. This would be led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, you see here. He would be promoted to Supreme Allied Commander of all Allied forces on D-Day, as it will come to be known. Of course, there were lots of challenges. Hitler had very much fortified this area in anticipation of an attack. So when the day came, D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the Normandy, France landings began, it was a very large, coordinated attack with, known to be a lot of casualties that day. And after successfully gaining a foothead, and a foothold in Normandy and in Western Europe that will begin the successful liberation of Western Europe from the Nazis. And by the end of the summer, Paris will be freed. We talked about D-Day being particularly significant in Virginia, and particularly significant in Bedford, Virginia, a small town that suffered the highest per capita losses on that day. Of the Bedford boys, many of them died in the first wave of the attack, and we talked about how come that is the reason why Bedford was selected as the National D-Day Memorial. So it has some local significance to us. In the final days of World War II in Europe, the Germans put on a last assault against Allied advances in the West called the Battle of the Bulge. They are not successful in stopping Allied advancements into Germany. We open up sustained bombing, aerial bombing of Hamburg and Dresden to try to eliminate their resource base and further the end of the war. By May 1945, Berlin will fall, Hitler commits suicide, and VE Day, Victory in Europe, is accomplished. Of course, after the war is over, we realize the full extent of what Nazi rule had meant in Europe. The Holocaust is a term that becomes associated with the worst example of genocide. Genocide meaning it's a systematic, it's purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious group. From 1933 to 1945, the years that Hitler was in charge of Germany and carrying out the war, he murdered an estimated 6 million Jews and millions of other Nazi, quote, undesirables, included amongst those gypsies, Poles, and Slavs. When we talk about systematic and purposeful, and we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about genocide, this is not just deaths caused by war. This is a system. This was purposeful murder of an entire group of people. We had talked about earlier in the 1930s the Nazis' effort to separate and isolate the Jews from the rest of the population. The system is expanded once the war begins, and then this phrase final solution is the decision, the code name for the decision that the Nazis make to go ahead and carry out their plan to eliminate the Jews from Europe. So it is a purposeful killing that the Nazis are attempting to carry out, showing sort of the final solution, systematic purpose, and systematic carrying out of murder. We talked about the fact that the Jews would be taken in cattle cars to many of the concentration camps, the most famous being Auschwitz in Poland, the largest of the killing centers. The guards would divide those who were taken to the concentration camps, and those who would survive for a while would be given prisoner numbers, uniforms. Those who were sick or older or women and children were sent directly to the gas chambers. An estimated 1 million people alone at Auschwitz were killed. We talked about, the evidence that remained. We looked at this picture from a museum at Birkenbau of human hair, shoes, clothing left behind, suitcases of the victims who had been told that they were just simply being relocated, all the valuables that had been stolen from the victims by the Nazis, and of course the horror of what was discovered upon liberation of piles of bodies, open pits, bodies remaining in the ovens of this Holocaust. We talked about the fact that there were a few survivors in the camps who bore witness to the horrific conditions of the camps, and the fact that after the war was over there was an international effort to hold those responsible for the Holocaust responsible for their crimes. This international tribunal was called the Nuremberg Trials, held in Nuremberg, Germany. Several high-ranking Nazis were convicted of war crimes against humanity. The trials emphasized their individual responsibility for their actions during the war. You couldn't just say, well, I was just following out orders. This was an effort to hold individuals personally responsible for their part in the war crimes against humanity that had taken place during the war. It also, because of the horror of what was exposed to have happened during the Holocaust, led to an increased demand for a Jewish homeland. Please review these slides that included both the war itself and, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust and the aftermath. In the last slides and videos, we'll talk about World War II in the Pacific.